So in the last lecture, I introduced the idea of plagues and how devastating they can be to human populations. Before we take a look at why the modern plagues of HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, and some other diseases are so concentrated in certain parts of the world, like Africa and Southeast Asia, let's take a look at just some basic terminology that's associated with infectious disease, some of the basic ways we think about infectious disease. So first of all, what is an infectious disease? And in this slide, I've put the emphasis on the word disease. What's a disease? A disease is anything that changes your health away from normal. So we see in this picture, this gentleman is obviously ill. He's in a bed, he's receiving fluids, so his fluid balances may be off, he might have a fever, right? All of these things indicate that his body is not functioning optimally, and so that is what we would define as a disease, right? So a disease is any change away from normal health, and we describe diseases by their signs and symptoms. And the difference between these two terms, a sign is something that someone else can measure, right? So I can have a fever and somebody can use a thermometer and measure my fever. A symptom is something that I feel. So maybe I have a headache or I feel cold. Another person can't measure that. So that's a symptom, right? So signs and symptoms together for any disease, there's a list of signs and symptoms that sort of go with that disease. Right, so what about this other term, infectious? What does that mean? What's an infectious disease compared to a non-infectious disease? Well, an infectious disease can spread, right? It can be transmitted from one person to another. And here's a picture from the CDC showing the life cycle of the malarial parasite. Now, this is one of the most complicated life cycles that I've ever seen in biology, and I've looked at a few life cycles. The parasite that causes malaria has to spend part of its time in the mosquito, and so on the left here with the red arrows, you're seeing life stages of how this parasite changes when it's inside the mosquito, and then it's transmitted to humans when the mosquito bites, and then it goes through more life stages in the human, and it can spread from human to human when a mosquito bites one human and then travels and bites another. So it's an infectious disease because it is caused by a microorganism that it can be spread from one person to another. And this picture here is just showing scientists working on an infectious organism that must be pretty dangerous, because this is a biosafety level 3 laboratory, which is one of the higher levels of safety. So you can see the people are in full suits that don't allow the infectious agent to be transmitted to them. You can see that they have air that's filtered, so even their air is being protected so that they don't breathe in those pathogens, because if you breathe in pathogens into your lungs, that can cause dangerous forms of disease, right? So we can see that they're protecting themselves from these pathogens, right? So an infectious disease can be transmitted. It can spread from one person to another. And when we look at infectious diseases, one of the things we always want to know is, how is this disease spread? So we know that malaria is spread by mosquitoes. We know that HIV is spread by transfer of bodily fluids, right? So knowing how a disease is spread helps us control it. And that spread is called transmission. And then I used this word a couple of times. I said pathogen. What's a pathogen? A pathogen is an organism that can cause disease. And often, or most of the time in this class, we are talking about microorganisms, small organisms like bacteria, viruses, and some parasites, right? Fungi can also cause disease, and there are small cells called protozoa that cause some diseases, and we will talk about these things in more detail in another lecture. And then who's getting sick? Well, the host. The host is the place where the pathogen is moving in and taking over. So if you're sick, you are the host. So I said that we want to think about how our disease is transmitted. And so in this slide, you see some different ways that things can be transmitted. So some diseases are spread through the air. So things like influenza or the common cold or measles, we get those by breathing air that somebody else has breathed out and that has pathogens in it. So you can see during the outbreak of the SARS disease, many people were wearing masks in Asia to try and help protect them from getting sick. Or we know that mosquitoes transmit malaria and also dengue fever. So we can try and control mosquitoes. We can try and kill mosquitoes or protect people from mosquitoes to help stop transmission of those diseases. You can also get diseases through contaminated food or water. So you can eat undercooked meat perhaps and get a dangerous form of E. coli that'll give you a diarrheal disease. You could have contaminated water that has the bacterium that causes cholera, a very dangerous diarrheal disease, right? Through body fluids like HIV, right? Some things are only spread through very intimate contact. Or you could have contact with a contaminated object. So for example, with HIV, you could share needles. Some people share needles when they're doing injection drugs, and that can spread HIV. Or you could touch a doorknob that somebody left mucus on, and then you touch your own eye or your nose, and that mucus gets transmitted to you. So you can pick up diseases through contact with contaminated objects, right? And then I've already mentioned things like mosquitoes. These are called vectors, these animals that can transmit disease from one place to another. So why do these things, once they get inside you, why do they cause disease? And there's a number of different ways that pathogens can cause disease. Sometimes it's very direct. They make poisons, they make toxins, they make neurotoxins that stop your nerves from working correctly, or enterotoxins that might disrupt your digestive system, leading to that diarrhea, right? So there's lots of different kinds of toxins that pathogens can make. They also can make enzymes, these little proteins that help them invade your body. They might break down your tissues, right? When that's going to cause signs and symptoms if they're destroying your tissues, right? And then there's also just that they come in and they destroy your cells. This is often what viruses do. Viruses come in, they move into your body, they live inside your cells, and they blow your cells up as they reproduce. And so that's going to cause signs and symptoms of disease. And a lot of the things that we associate with disease, just sort of general malaise. You'll often hear people talk about, oh, this disease has flu-like symptoms. You're kind of achy, you've got mucus, maybe you've got some swelling, right? These are all signs of the response of your body, the inflammation that your body goes through to try and fight the disease. So many of the things that we think of as signs and symptoms of disease, like a fever, are actually responses of our body fighting those diseases. And so it can be very uncomfortable, even if it's beneficial to try and help stop the pathogen, right? Okay, so there's a little bit of basics on diseases, some terminology that goes along with them. And in the next lecture, we'll take a look again at why infectious disease seems to be concentrated in certain parts of the world.